different players in every market and folks looking for solutions. So basically, rather than having sort of a nationwide provider, you may have nationwide solution providers, but they'll be working with folks locally to deploy the white space application that makes sense in that market. And so a couple of things that we heard that were also pretty interesting on that score. So one idea was, and this sounds completely real, is that you'll basically have white space devices built on Wi-Fi chipsets, so that in a couple, really in a couple of years, you'll have a situation where you go into a setting with your laptop, and it will basically figure out, okay, is Wi-Fi access better, or we have the ability for a little bit wider access. So basically, inside like a place like this convention center, where you might have sort of a white space node in this convention center rather than a series of Wi-Fi nodes, you'll basically have a device that will do that. So it's basically just an add-on to Wi-Fi. That's one typical Wi-Fi. That was one idea. The other idea, folks are obviously talking about. There was another provider who's basically talking about it being sort of a wide area internet access server. And then what we heard this afternoon, right, Barlow, was that the first to roll out, because they don't quite take the intelligence, will be these point-to-point, sort of a point-to-point or basically a backhaul type of system in a rural area that will be ready for deployment almost immediately.
Yeah, so the date for deployment will be, the first available date would be April the 24th. We're waiting for the database companies to get approved by the FCC. They've been conditionally approved. That happened on January 26th. They're going to have some meetings, and hopefully we may have our first rollout on April 24th.
Yeah. So
let me follow up there with some particular questions of timing that people want to know. April 24th, 2011, something's happening in Washington. What is that?
Well, what's happening in Washington will be before then, and that means in the next couple of months, they will get the database providers to go through testing, and a database provider can potentially be approved by April 24th.
Okay. When are the first services going to be there that people can buy? What will they be and where?
So right now, you'd have to put up antennas. Fixed antennas will be the only initial service that will be purchased, and WISP will be selling that service. And so they'll have an antenna up on top of a house, and that antenna will be connected to another fixed antenna somewhere in a rural area.
I live in Manhattan. Is it going to make any difference for me?
In Manhattan, as I mentioned before, the way the FCC designed it, you will not be able to use white spaces because you cannot put a fixed radio up. Within the next 24 months, the chipsets will be developed, and you'll have new mobile phones that can use white spaces. And so maybe in 24 months, you can use a mobile device which is low powered in Manhattan.
And when will most mobile phones be able to play with this?
Well,
when is it going to be in my iPhone?
It would be, I'm going to speculate in your iPhone, the best case scenario in 2 years. That would be the best case scenario. It is in some phones where you have media flow, Qualcomm's media flow, and you have 700 megahertz, and you can see TV station. That's sort of in that area, but it's not a white space device.
Okay. What else do people need to know?
I think that they need to watch and make sure that the FCC approves these database providers, and they also need to see if they could follow at the FCC comments that are being requested to see how these database companies can use their database in a more value-added way.
Last question from me, Jen, you may have after that. Can people make a difference in this by filing with the FCC, for example, or sending emails to the folks in the Wireless Bureau? Can there be do people make an impact in Washington, or do you need to hire fancy Washington lawyers?
Well, I can answer that question, and I'll let Marty, because he's a fancy Washington lawyer. But it's a very good idea to work with other teams or associations if you file comments, or to have an attorney file the comment, only because there's so many comments that get filed that often they won't read, or they may not take into account the comment of the lowly citizen.
Yeah.
That's my opinion.
Well, I think so. It really depends what it is you want to say, and what is it you want to say, and what is the issue you want to file comments about. So one of the you asked, will you be able to use white spaces in Manhattan? In the foreseeable future, probably not. If the Commission, FCC, gives further flexibility to broadcasters, then if flexibility broadcasters do marketplace deals, then you actually might have the ability to use white spaces.
Jenny, got a question or two?
This is a done consumer question. You're talking about these database providers. How do we know once they get the ability to use white spaces, they won't stick it to us just like the cable companies do?
Well, the FCC in their order, there are 9 database providers so there's plenty of competition. There's only one cable company that you have, so there'll be a lot of competition. And the FCC has stated in their order that they want them to provide the service at just barely above cost, a very low cost, at the basic service. But there'll be extra services, value-added services that they can sell to different people. So you'll get the basic service.
Well, and realistically, the database providers could be transparent to the consumer. Consumers are not going to be dealing with the database providers. Folks who are rolling out the services will be. So you won't have to worry about the database provider unless you could go into the business.
Yeah, like today you get, to be on the internet, you use DNS, and you may not know what that is, but you use it, and their DNS providers, their database provider as well. But your ISP pays for that, and then the ISP charges you a little bit, and you pay for it with a few pennies.
Okay. And will white spaces make any difference to the millions of underserved people in this country that are not getting broadband and didn't get it with the broadband initiative?
Well, that depends. White spaces could potentially make a big difference because it's a lot of available unlicensed spectrum that you don't have to pay for. But that question sort of rolls back to Marty's focus, which is on whether you can finance a business to reach all those customers. Marty?
Yeah, well, actually, in answer to the question, probably one of the places where white spaces will most immediately have an impact will be in rural areas where there isn't a lot of congestion, a lot of broadcast stations. So actually, that is probably the first place where it will be more ubiquitous, and then I can't answer that.
Yeah, but I want to say that white spaces has the potential, because it's unlicensed and it's not 2.4 and it's pure, in other words, no one is using it, pure beachfront property, that you could use it in the cities as a third competitor. Right now we have 2 competitors in the cities, as a third true broadband competitor, and reach some of the underserved areas in the city, or areas that do not have a lot of.
Yeah, if the spectrum is available, and that's going to be the question. There is a proceeding right now at the FCC about reallocation of broadcast spectrum, and the question is, what will the Commission do? One of the questions is, will the Commission give broadcasters more flexibility? Will the Commission make available an additional swath of unlicensed spectrum that had been broadcast spectrum for use by white spaces? If they do, I mean, that could actually potentially make white spaces available in the city, inner city. So I will have to say, if just to wrap up, Barlow, I actually came away from the last 2 days, pretty excited about the potential for white spaces coming in. Here it wasn't quite as concrete, and there are actually quite a lot of folks who are focused on it in a concrete way. There's money in the sector, and maybe more money coming into the sector. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of models that people have not considered, and at the conference we talked about some models with the investment banks that were there that may be doable, and ones they haven't thought about before. But there certainly is a need. There's a need in the rural area. There's a need in the urban area. And so, and this is Super Wi-Fi. It's Wi-Fi on steroids. Was what
you had to say that.
That's what Google said.
But they didn't back away from it.
Right. Larry Page at Google has his quote.
Yeah.
What's the most misunderstood thing about white spaces that you'd like to clear up? Since you have this a forum.
It's funny. I'd put it the other way. What are some of the understood things about white spaces? I think people probably don't really understand what white spaces are. I'll tell you.
Yeah.
The one, to me, the sort of first misunderstood thing about white spaces is that it's not sort of slivers of spectrum. It's basically the unused television spectrum in an unused television channel in markets. That's what white spaces are. So, fundamentally, they're at 6 megahertz blocks. So that's a bit of spectrum. It's not a sliver of spectrum in between stations. So that was the first misunderstood thing for me.
Yeah, it's 6 megahertz. You can put 20 megabytes of service on there. But I think the biggest misunderstanding is that when you go really look at white spaces in the urban areas, including Washington, D.C., which is where it all came from, and Miami, where we're here today, you cannot put up a tower, they call it a fixed radio, and serve customers. And that, to me, is absurd. So I'm looking for a fix.
Okay.
Anyway, so exciting 2 days, Barlow. Thank you very much for having me. Marty Stern, Barlow Keener. We are live. We're almost live from Miami Beach, Florida, the beautiful Miami Beach Convention Center. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.